Hey everybody, this is your Right Geek, Honorary Man King, and leader of the Awkward Cough Squad, here with another video. Today I am going to do another one of those random number generator videos comparing a modern day Iron Man comic to an older Iron Man comic that is randomly generated with my random number generator. So this one here, of course, is issue 4 of Dan Slott's Iron Man 2020, which has the kind of boring, tedious robot revolution plot with Tony Stark's evil and maniacal brother, which nobody cares about. And yeah, this issue didn't make me want to care about it anymore. But I do want to note, just for the purpose of the comparison I'm about to do, as it turns out, Tony is not dead, or at least the simulacrum of Tony Stark is not actually dead. When he was shot, his consciousness was basically pulled into the this 13th floor into the Eastgate. And while he is in the Eastgate, we have this scene where basically he is being convinced that he is in fact Tony Stark, despite his belief that he's just an inferior copy. And the one thing that I noticed about this scene that it didn't really work for me, because this is supposed to be aspects of his own consciousness convincing them that he really is Tony Stark, and it's all about emotional validation. All of these kind of snapshots of Tony throughout his life are essentially validating him and telling him that he's a hero, he's meant to be a hero, and he's ready to be that hero that that the world needs. Now, the reason why that doesn't work for me is because I know Tony Stark, and as someone who has a fairly deep knowledge of Iron Man canon, if I do say so myself, Tony, since this is supposed to be Tony talking to himself, right, I don't buy it, because Tony would never talk to himself this way. Tony is not the kind of character who would sit there and validate himself. He is the kind of character who is always criticizing himself and thinking about all the ways that that he's failed, or that how he could improve. At least that's how he was written back in the main era, in the stable era, in the original era of Iron Man. He was a very self-critical character. But here, like, these aspects of himself, they're not criticizing him, they're just emotionally validating him. And that's why this didn't really work for me. It doesn't feel satisfying somehow that after this conversation with all of these aspects of himself, oh yeah, he just suddenly decides, oh yeah, I really am the Tony Stark. I feel like if he had that deep doubt that he was actually the real guy, and he really felt like he was just a simulacrum, I feel like it should have taken much more struggle and soul searching, and kind of a Dark Night of the Soul situation, over a much longer period of time for him to discover that he is the real guy. And I don't think it would happen through it wouldn't happen through basically an internal conversation with himself. I think he would have to actually perform some action in the world that would remind him that Yes, I am the hero. Tony Stark. I am that guy. Um, but the idea that he would be able to convince himself, uh, just internally inside of his own consciousness, I don't buy it. It doesn't really fit the character that I understand and the character that I know. Um, in contrast, we have the uh, the old issue from the main era that my random number generator pulled up. Oh, come on, don't fail me now. And my random number generator pulled up 313, which is towards the end of what I consider the main era. It's in the 90s, so now the art is starting to get a little bit on the kind of extreme side. Um, and things are starting to get just on the end of trashy here in terms of art and portrayal and story and so on. But this issue is actually kind of interesting because it basically features Tony Stark in an AA meeting, essentially providing the reader a summary of how he came to start drinking as a habit, and then how he ultimately became someone who drank to excess and drank to an unhealthy degree. So it's like it's catching up. Anyone who's picking up the Iron Man comics in the 90s will pick this up and kind of get the caught up story of how he became an alcoholic. And, there's interesting aspects about that story, like the fact that it was Howard Stark who first introduced him to alcohol when he was a little kid, which is all sorts of problematic and wrong. Uh, um, and what's interesting about that, you know, his dad is saying, drink this to be strong, to be tough, to be a man. And of course, he, he doesn't like the taste. Um, but he swallows it anyway just to get his messed up dad's approval, essentially. Um, and it's funny that he still forgives. He still is inclined to forgive his father for this, even though it's really, really dysfunctional and messed up. He's still like, my father wasn't a bad man. Stern, yes. Hard, perhaps. But he was an honorable man, in many ways a great one. So, like, even though we had this messed up situation where his father was essentially an alcoholic and introduced him to alcohol way too young for the purpose of him becoming a man, um, uh, which again is just all sorts of problematic. He's still kind of in this space of wanting to forgive him instead of going into that criticism of his father. Um, so the other interesting thing about this issue, which is more relevant to what I was discussing before with the Iron Man 2020, happens here when he is talking to Mrs. Arbogast about a brief relapse that he had a few issues back, which it was a relapse that wasn't really under his control because he was being mind controlled by an artificial intelligence, which is all. One day I'm actually going to talk about that issue because that issue is all sorts of disturbing. um, it's disturbing in so many ways, but if you like disturbing, that might be an issue I can go through with you guys. Um, but anyway, so he calls Mrs. Arbogast in to basically apologize for the fact that he was drunk on that particular day due to due to being mind controlled. And he talks about how much he appreciates her as an employee, And then she's like, "You're buttering me up for something. All right, out with it." And then he says, "I also want to apologize for last week. Nursemaiding me like that isn't part of your job description." And then Mrs. Arbogast is just like, "Rubbish. For someone who's supposed to be a genius, he can be pretty blasted dense sometimes. There's not a soul here who wouldn't help you carry this building to the other side of the country if you needed it. It's when you need help and you're too bloody stubborn to ask for it that we get mad. You might not have had a drinking problem in the first place if you knew enough to lean on someone else once in a while. And as God's my witness, the next time you need my help and don't ask for it, I'll swear I'll knock your full teeth in." So, the reason why I think that this scene is so great and why it's an interesting comparison scene to the Iron Man 2020 issue 4 is that we have, it's not Tony talking to himself, it's someone else in his life who's talking to him, and the key is she is not validating his behavior. She is yelling at him for being resistant to asking for help, and she points out correctly that the reason why he developed a drinking problem to begin with is because of how reticent he is and how much he does not, how unwilling he is to be open with other people and to kind of bring people into his world and explain what's going on in his head. So here we have basically Tony getting straightened out by someone else who is willing to actually criticize him and critique him for the things that he's doing wrong, for the things that are not adaptive, essentially, for the things that are not healthy. Whereas in the new comic, it seems to be all about he's just sitting there in his own mind, validating himself. And to me, I just find that very unsatisfying and not very much in character with the Tony Stark that I'm familiar with as someone who is a fairly deep reader of the Iron Man comics. So anyway, that is the end of my comparison contrast exercise. I'd be interested to hear your comments and thoughts in the comments below. Please let me know what you think, and I will talk to you again on Thursday.